and when everything came out, the whole country knew my name. My own children made sure of that, just not in the way they planned. My name is Gerald. I'm 67 years old. For 41 years, I ran a small but steady construction supply company out of Sudbury, Ontario. Nothing flashy. We supplied lumber, hardware, roofing materials to contractors across northern Ontario. I built that business the same way I built everything in my life. Slowly, carefully, without shortcuts. My late wife, Dorothy, used to say I was the most patient man she'd ever met. She said it like a compliment. Near the end, I wondered if she meant it as a warning. Dorothy passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning, I held her hand in the palliative care ward at Health Sciences North. 6 weeks. I still haven't fully accepted it. I don't think I ever will. After she was gone, I sold the business. Not immediately. I held on for about a year, mostly because going into the office gave me somewhere to put my grief. But eventually, the offers got serious, and a regional distributor out of Barrie made one I couldn't refuse. After taxes and fees, I walked away with just over $2 million. I owned my house outright. I had a pension from the business, modest RRSP contributions going back decades, and no debt. I was, by any reasonable measure, comfortable. I have 2 children. My son Richard is 42. He lives in Mississauga with his wife and their 2 teenagers. He works in commercial real estate, or he used to. I later found out the business had been struggling badly. My daughter, Karen, is 38. She lives in Ottawa, works in government procurement, and has 1 son, Thomas, who is 14. Thomas is the one who matters most in this story. Remember that. I want to be honest about something. After Dorothy died, I leaned on my children, maybe too much. I called Richard almost every day for the first year. I drove to Mississauga more weekends than I should have. I sent money when they mentioned things were tight. A few thousand here, some help with the grandchildren's hockey fees there. I don't regret any of it, but I think, looking back, it taught them something about me that I hadn't intended to teach. It taught them that I was someone who could be managed. The conversation started about 14 months after I sold the company. Richard called on a Sunday evening. He always called on Sunday evenings, which I now understand was deliberate, when I was relaxed and less guarded. He mentioned, very casually, that his financial advisor had brought up the idea of estate planning. He said it in a way that made it sound like something he was doing for me, a favor, a responsible son thinking ahead. He said he knew a good lawyer in Toronto who specialized in this kind of thing, and that it might give me peace of mind to have everything organized. I said I already had a will. Dorothy and I had done it together years ago. He said that will was outdated. Things had changed. The estate was larger now. He said the lawyer could make sure everything was structured to minimize probate fees, protect the assets, keep it out of court. All sensible things. All the right words. I said I'd think about it. Over the next few months, Karen joined those conversations. She started calling more frequently, which I was glad for at first. She'd ask how I was doing, whether I was eating well, whether I'd thought any more about the estate plan. She said she and Richard just wanted to make sure I was protected. She said, "Dad, we've seen what happens to families when this isn't handled properly. It gets messy. We don't want that for you." I remember telling Dorothy's sister Margaret about those calls. Margaret is sharp. Sharper than me, honestly. And she said, "Gerald, be careful. Your children love you. I'm sure they do. But love and money in the same conversation is a complicated thing." I nodded and changed the subject. I wish I hadn't. In January, Richard suggested a trip. He said he and Karen both wanted to take me somewhere for my birthday in March. Something special. A real celebration. He mentioned Vancouver Island. A few days in Victoria, maybe a whale-watching excursion, some good restaurants. He said it would be good for me to get out of Sudbury in the winter, and he was right about that. Sudbury in February is something only the people who live there truly understand. He mentioned, almost as a footnote, that there would be some paperwork to review while we were there. The lawyer had drawn up some documents related to the estate plan. Nothing complicated, just a framework to look over. Richard said it would be better to do it in person. in a relaxed setting rather than through the mail. He said, "You can read it over dinner, ask any questions, and we can just get it done." I should have asked more questions right then. But it was January. I was lonely, and my children were offering me a trip to the Pacific coast. We flew into Victoria on a Thursday afternoon in early March. The city was beautiful, in a way. Sudbury simply isn't in winter. Green and mild, flowers already starting in the hanging baskets along Government Street. We had dinner at a restaurant in the inner harbor that first night, and it was genuinely lovely. Richard was warm and funny. Karen seemed relaxed. I thought maybe I'd been reading too much into things. I thought, these are my children. They love me. The next morning at breakfast, Richard set a folder on the table beside my coffee. He said, "Dad, I thought we could just take a look at these this morning, get it out of the way before we go out." I asked what it was exactly. He said it was what the lawyer had prepared, a framework for the estate. He said it would transfer management of certain assets into a family trust structure with him and Karen as co-trustees to make the eventual transfer simpler and avoid lengthy probate proceedings. I picked up the folder. There were about 30 pages. I am not a lawyer, and I don't pretend to be, but I've signed enough contracts in 40 years of business to know that you don't sign 30 pages over breakfast without reading every line. I said I wanted time to review it. Richard said there was a notary booked for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Something shifted in me right then. It was a small shift, almost physical, like a door closing very quietly somewhere inside my chest. I had run a business for 4 decades. I had negotiated contracts, dealt with suppliers, managed employees, handled difficult clients. I knew what it felt like when someone was trying to move you through a process faster than you should go. I said I would not be signing anything that afternoon. The rest of that day was tense in a way I hadn't anticipated. Richard said I was being paranoid. Karen said she understood, but that I really should trust them, that they weren't trying to take anything from me, that this was about protecting the family. She said the word family 4 times in one conversation. I counted. That evening I excused myself early and went back to my hotel room. I called Margaret. I told her about the folder, the notary, the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for Margaret. When I finished, she said, "Gerald, you don't sign anything until your own lawyer reads it. Not 1 page." I already knew that, but I needed to hear someone else say it. The next morning, I told Richard and Karen that I wanted to enjoy the rest of the trip, and that I would have my lawyer in Sudbury review the documents when I got home. I kept my voice calm. I kept my voice the way Dorothy always told me to keep it when things got difficult. Steady, quiet, without heat. What happened next I still don't entirely understand, even after everything that followed. After lunch that Saturday, Richard suggested we walk through Beacon Hill Park. It's a large park in Victoria, beautiful in March, the kind of place you walk slowly and talk about things that matter. We walked for about 40 minutes. Then Karen said she wanted to find a washroom, and Richard said he needed to check something on his phone, and they both drifted back toward the park entrance. I kept walking. I assumed they'd catch up. I walked to the petting zoo section, watched the peacocks for a while, sat on a bench. After about 20 minutes, I started back toward the entrance. They weren't there. I walked to where we'd parked. The rental car was gone. I had my jacket, my reading glasses, and a small amount of cash, maybe $60, because I had left my wallet in the hotel room safe that morning after Richard had suggested we travel light for the walk. My phone had died sometime during lunch, and I hadn't brought my charger. I didn't know the hotel's address. I knew the name, the Empress, which is famous enough that I assumed anyone could direct me. I wasn't in a foreign country. I was in Victoria, British Columbia. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I went to a nearby coffee shop and asked to use their phone to call the hotel. They connected me to my room. No answer. I asked the front desk to leave a message for my son in his room. They told me there was no guest by that name registered. I stood very still for a moment. I asked about Karen, also not registered. They were never staying at the hotel. I had assumed we were all at the same hotel because they'd said, "We're staying at the Empress," and I'd assumed that meant all of us. My room was booked in my name. Their rooms apparently were somewhere else. I sat in that coffee shop for a long time. The young woman behind the counter, whose name tag said, "Priya," brought me a glass of water without me asking. She could see something was wrong. I told her I'd been separated from my family, and my phone was dead. She let me use the shop's charger for 20 minutes. I called Richard's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called Karen's. Same. What I felt in those first 2 hours is difficult to describe. It wasn't fear exactly. I was in Canada, I spoke the language, I had ID in my hotel room, I had resources I could access once I got back to my room. It was something closer to a specific kind of grief. The grief of a certainty being removed. The certainty that my children would not do something like this. I walked back to the hotel. It took about 45 minutes. I'm 67 and my left knee has been bad since a construction site accident in 2009. But I walked the whole way. Back in my room, I sat on the bed and I thought clearly. The way you think clearly when there's no other option. I called Margaret. I called my lawyer in Sudbury, a woman named Patricia Chen who had handled the business sale and whom I trusted completely. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Gerald, don't sign anything. Don't delete anything. Save every text message and write down everything you remember about the last 3 days. Tonight." I did exactly that. I wrote 6 pages in the hotel notepad. I stayed in Victoria 2 more days. Richard texted me once, the next afternoon, a message that said simply, "Hope you're doing okay, Dad. Talk soon." No explanation. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened in the park. I did not respond. When I got back to Sudbury, Patricia had already spoken with a colleague who specialized in elder law and the state litigation. She had reviewed the documents Richard had given me. I'd taken photos of every page before the trip, a habit from 40 years of business. And she told me what they actually said. The trust structure in those documents would have transferred effective control of my liquid assets to Richard and Karen as co-trustees immediately upon signing. The provision for my own access to those funds required their joint approval for any withdrawal over $5,000. The documents included a clause, buried on page 22, that defined incapacity broadly enough that a single letter from a physician, any physician, could trigger a full transfer of trustee authority with no further consent from me required. I had been, in the language Patricia used, one signature away from a significant loss of financial autonomy. I won't describe in detail what happened legally over the following months. I will say that we filed a complaint with the Law Society of Ontario regarding the lawyer who had drafted those documents. I will say that Patricia sent formal letters to both Richard and Karen outlining the legal exposure they faced. I will say that the Victoria incident, being left in Beacon Hill Park without a working phone or transportation, became part of a documented pattern that our elder law colleague described as consistent with financial elder abuse under the criminal code. Richard and Karen hired their own lawyers. Things became, for several months, very cold and very formal and very painful in the way that only family disputes can be. Here is where the news part comes in. Patricia's elder law colleague, a man named David Okafor, was connected to an advocacy organization in Ontario called the Elder Financial Safety Network. He asked was my permission if I would be willing to speak with a journalist who was working on a piece about financial elder abuse in Canada, specifically targeting cases involving adult children and estate planning manipulation. He said my case was, unfortunately, a clear example of a pattern they were seeing with increasing frequency. I said yes. Not out of anger, though I had anger. I said yes because I thought about how many other 67-year-olds were sitting in hotel rooms in unfamiliar cities, writing notes on hotel notepads, wondering how their family had become something unrecognizable. The piece ran in the Globe and Mail on a Tuesday morning in October. It did not name Richard or Karen. It named me, Gerald Whitmore, Sudbury, Ontario, and told the story in general terms. It discussed the documents. It discussed the park. It discussed the broader pattern. By Wednesday afternoon, it had been picked up by CBC News. By Thursday, it was on the radio. I did a short phone interview with a station in Toronto. I did another with a community paper in Sudbury that had covered my business for 30 years. I don't know exactly when Richard and Karen saw it. Richard called me that Thursday evening. It was the first time he'd called since the single text message in Victoria. He didn't apologize. He asked if I understood what I was doing to the family. He said I was humiliating everyone. He said, "Dad, this is going to follow us forever." I said, "Richard, you left me in a park." He didn't have an answer for that. Karen sent an email. It was long and it was defensive, and it used the word misunderstanding 11 times. I read it once and forwarded it to Patricia. "I want to tell you about Thomas. Karen's son, my grandson, is 14 years old. He lives in Ottawa and plays hockey and is currently reading his way through every Terry Fox biography he can find, which I find extremely admirable. He and I have always been close in the way that skips generations sometimes. We text each other about hockey stats. We argue good-naturedly about whether the Senators will ever be worth watching again." 3 days after the Globe and Mail piece ran, I got a text from Thomas. He texted me a lot. This one said, "Grandpa, I read the article. I'm really sorry. That wasn't okay." Then a second text, "I want you to know I don't care about the money. I just want you to be okay." I sat with my phone for a long time after that. I texted him back. I told him it meant more to me than he knew. I told him he was already a better man than most people twice his age, and that his grandmother would have said the same thing. He sent back 3 words, "I know, Grandpa." That was the moment the weight shifted. I won't tell you the legal situation resolved cleanly, because it didn't. There are no clean resolutions in family disputes. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Richard and Karen did not face criminal charges. The standard for elder financial abuse prosecution in Canada is high, and the situation hadn't progressed far enough. What happened instead was a formal legal agreement, negotiated through lawyers, establishing clear boundaries. My estate documents were redrawn entirely by Patricia. The trust structure was discarded, and both Richard and Karen acknowledged in writing that the Victoria incident had caused harm. That acknowledgement cost them something, I think. It should have. I still live in Sudbury. I still own my house on Maley Drive, the one Dorothy chose because of the way the light came through the kitchen window on winter mornings. I have a coffee every Tuesday with Margaret. I have become, somewhat unexpectedly, a quiet advocate for elder financial safety in Northern Ontario. I've spoken at 2 community forums, and I sit on an advisory panel for a seniors resource center. I speak to Thomas every week. He came to visit me last summer, and we went fishing on Ramsey Lake, which is something I used to do with my father, and something I hope Thomas will someday do with his own children. I don't speak to Richard, not because I refuse to. I've told him the door's open, that I love him in the way you always love your children, that complicated feeling that doesn't go away even when it should. But he hasn't come through it yet. Maybe he will. I don't speak to Karen either, for the same reason. There are people who ask me if I'm bitter. It's a fair question. I think about it honestly when it comes up. What I feel is not quite bitterness. It's more like a permanent clarity I didn't ask for. I know now what my children were willing to do. I know now what my grandson wasn't willing to do. I know which of those pieces of knowledge I would rather carry. Dorothy would have been devastated by all of this. She believed in family the way she believed in everything, completely and without hedging. But I think she would have been proud of one thing. She always told me that real dignity isn't how you carry yourself when things go well. It's how you carry yourself in Beacon Hill Park, with $60 in your pocket and the dead phone, figuring out what to do next. I figured out what to do next. And the whole country heard about it. When I think about everything that happened, Victoria, the park bench, the folder with 30 pages, the phone call from Thomas, I keep coming back to one simple truth. The choices we make in quiet moments define everything that follows in the loud ones. I didn't do anything heroic. I want to be clear about that. I walked 45 minutes on a bad knee. I asked a young woman named Priya if I could use a phone charger, and I called my lawyer. Those are not dramatic actions, but they were the right ones. And I made them because 41 years of running a business had taught me that when someone tries to rush you through a door, the most important thing you can do is stop walking. That's the first thing I'd want anyone to take from my story. Pressure is not a reason to act. Pressure is a reason to pause. Richard and Karen built an entire architecture of urgency around those documents. The notary at 2 o'clock, the lawyer already retained, the trip framed as a celebration. Every piece of it was designed to make stopping feel unreasonable. The moment I recognized that design, I understood something essential. Good decisions rarely require you to hurry. The second thing is harder to talk about, because it involves looking honestly at my own role in what happened. I gave my children money when they struggled. I called too often in my grief. I made myself, without meaning to, into someone who could be managed. I don't say this to take responsibility for their choices. What they did was wrong, and I know that clearly. But I think there is a form of intelligence that only comes from examining how we contributed to the conditions that hurt us, not to punish ourselves, to understand the shape of our own vulnerabilities so we can protect them going forward. And the third thing, the one that matters most to me now, is about what Richard said on the phone when he finally called. He said I was humiliating everyone. He said this would follow them forever. He never once asked if I was okay. He never once said he was sorry for leaving me in that park. In that moment, I understood that the most devastating consequence of what they had done wasn't legal or financial. It was that they had revealed, under real pressure, exactly who they were. That kind of revelation cannot be undone. It just becomes something you know. Thomas texted me 3 sentences, and he understood more than his parents did with all their lawyers and planning. That is not an accident. Character like that doesn't come from nowhere. It grows slowly, from small decisions made over years, from choosing honesty when dishonesty would be easier. He is 14 years old, and he already knows that his grandfather's dignity matters more than any inheritance. I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure that understanding is rewarded. I am Gerald Whitmore. I live in Sudbury. I still drink my coffee on Melee Drive on winter mornings in the kitchen where the light comes through exactly the way Dorothy always loved. I am not bitter. I am not broken. I am, if anything, clearer than I have ever been about what matters and what doesn't. And I assure you, that clarity was worth every step of the walk home.